Welcome to the deep dive. So, today is Monday, March 16th, 2026. And, usually when we look at the macroeconomic health of a nation, the expectation is that it reads sort of like a clean medical x-ray.
Right. Yeah. You want to just put the chart up on a light box, point to a specific line and say, there's the problem, or look, a perfectly healthy society.
Exactly. But today we're looking at the state of Eritrea, and honestly, its diagnostic x-ray is just completely shattered.
It really is. I mean, it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. You simply cannot point to one single metric and declare the country a success or a failure.
Yeah, because the data we are looking at today tells two completely conflicting stories, like simultaneously.
Right. And our source material for this dive is it's incredibly dense. We're unpacking a comprehensive, data-driven academic report that details Eritrea's development trajectory.
Right, covering all the way from 1990 through 2023.
Exactly. And it's built on these massive underlying data sets from the World Development Indicators or the WDI.
Which covers everything, right? I mean, we're exploring the demographics, the wild macroeconomic swings, public health, trade, governance metrics.
Yeah, all of it. And our mission today is to figure out how a single state can exhibit these massive world-class victories sitting right next to deeply entrenched institutional bottlenecks.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I think this is why anyone interested in global development or economics or even just statecraft needs to really pay attention to this specific case study.
Oh, absolutely. Understanding Eritrea through this unfiltered data, it just shatters the illusion that national development is a straight upward staircase.
Right, it's not just a straight lineup.
Not at all. It proves that a nation can succeed brilliantly in executing highly complex tasks while fundamentally struggling to, maintain basic economic momentum.
It kind of completely redefines our assumptions about what state capacity actually means on the ground.
It really does.
Yeah.
So to even begin diagnosing a national economy, we have to start with the people.
Right, the human engine driving the whole machine.
Exactly. And the demographic profile in this WDI data set is, well, it's overwhelming. The academic report basically characterizes Eritrea over the last 3 decades as a demographic pressure cooker.
A pressure cooker. I like that analogy.
Yeah, because the sheer weight of the population structure is, it's the defining feature of their social landscape. The metric we need to isolate first is the youth dependency ratio.
Okay, and just to clarify for everyone listening, in macroeconomic terms, this is the ratio of children.
Specifically those under the age of 15.
Right, children under 15 compared to the active working age population, which is ages 15 to 64.
Correct.
So just conceptually, a high ratio means a relatively small group of adults is trying to financially support a massive group of children.
Yes, and the numbers here are just extreme. I mean, in the early 1990s, the data shows Eritrea's youth dependency ratio was already quite high. It was sitting at 74.4%.
Wow.
But instead of leveling off as the country entered a new era, it kept climbing. It accelerated until it peaked at a staggering 85.3%.
What, 85.3%? Around when was that?
Around the mid-2000s.
Let me just visualize that for a second. That means for every 100 working age adults in the entire country, there were roughly 85 children under the age of 15 relying on them for survival.
Exactly. And to give that the full demographic context, if we look at the old age dependency ratio,
Like the elderly population relying on the workforce.
right, that remained incredibly low during this entire 30-year span. It only fluctuated between just 4.7% and roughly 6 point something percent.
Oh, wow. So the dependent population isn't aging out at all. It is heavily skewed toward the youth.
Entirely skewed toward the youth.
In broader development economics, you always hear politicians talking about a youth bulge as this ultimate golden ticket.
Right, the famous demographic
I
dividend.
think the demographic dividend,
Right.
the narrative is always that a massive generation of young people will eventually enter the factories and the offices, and you get this unprecedented economic boom.
Well, that narrative completely ignores the brutal short-term mechanics of actually raising those children.
Right, they don't just magically become factory workers overnight.
Exactly. Before a society ever sees a demographic dividend, they have to pay the overhead. When your youth dependency ratio crosses 70%, and certainly when it hits 85%, it ceases to be a future asset.
It becomes a constraint.
An immediate crushing constraint.
Because every spare cent is basically spoken for.
Precisely. Think about the daily reality of a household in that economy. The working adults are carrying an enormous burden to simply feed, clothe, shelter, and, provide basic schooling for 3, 4, or 5 children.
Right.
If every single unit of local currency you earn goes toward immediate caloric and shelter survival, you are not putting money into a savings account.
And if citizens aren't depositing savings into local banks, those banks don't have the capital reserves to lend out to local entrepreneurs.
Exactly.
So if a business wants to build a new workshop or buy new farm equipment, the money just isn't there.
The entire society's ability to invest in physical capital is paralyzed by the biological necessity of sustaining the youth. It's a macroeconomic holding pattern.
That sounds incredibly stressful for a developing nation.
It is. However, the data does show a very subtle but critical shift in the most recent years leading up to 2023. That 85.3% peak has finally begun a slow downward trend.
Really? Why is that subtle drop significant?
Because that downward inflection point is, theoretically, the exact moment a developing economy transitions out of survival mode and into accumulation mode.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, when that ratio drops, it means households have slightly fewer children per working adult. They finally get a tiny margin of breathing room.
Right, so a fraction of income can finally be saved.
Capital can begin to accumulate in the banking system. It's the moment the pressure cooker lets off its first gasp of steam.
But for the majority of the timeline we're analyzing, from 1990 to roughly 2020, that massive 85% overhead was fully bearing down on the economy.
Fully bearing down.
So we have to look at how the Eritrean economy actually performed while trying to carry that weight. And the economic growth data is, well, calling it erratic doesn't quite capture it.
No, it doesn't. The primary indicator the report uses is gross national income, or GNI, per capita growth. And the volatility is severe enough to induce whiplash.
Whiplash is a good word for it.
We are looking at an economy that routinely swings wildly between double-digit growth and double-digit contraction.
Walk me through the timeline on that, because the extremes here are jarring.
Okay, so in 1997, the WDI data records a massive explosive surge in economic growth, hitting 16-point-something%.
By any global standard, a 16% growth rate in a single year is a staggering boom.
It's massive, but it completely evaporates. Just 3 years later, in the year 2000, that growth rate didn't just cool off to a sustainable 4 or 5%.
What happened?
It plummeted into a severe contraction, hitting negative 4.6%. And that volatility isn't isolated to the early years either. Fast forward to 2016, and the data logs an even deeper economic recession, with the growth rate crashing to negative 11.7%.
Wait, a negative 11.7% drop in national income in a single year.
Yes.
I am trying to imagine the localized panic of that. We aren't talking about a slight dip in the stock market. We are talking about a fundamental evaporation of wealth.
Exactly.
I mean, how does a family plan for the future? How does a government Ministry of Finance map out a 5-year infrastructure budget when the national income can swing 20 percentage points in a single decade?
Well, they largely can't, or at least they can't effectively execute long-term capital projects.
Right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, macroeconomic volatility of this magnitude tells us something very specific about the architecture of the country. It tells us that Eritrea lacks internal shock absorbers. It is hyper-vulnerable to external forces.
What kind of external forces are dragging the GDP down 11%?
The academic sources specifically point to severe climatic vulnerability in external conflicts. For example, between 1990 and 2009, extreme weather events,
Like what? Hurricanes?
specifically catastrophic droughts, they impacted up to 7.3% of the entire population.
Wow, 7.3%. Which makes sense, right? If your economy is entirely tethered to the topsoil, a lack of rain doesn't just mean a bad harvest for the farmer.
No, it triggers a cascading national recession.
The truck drivers have nothing to haul, the markets have nothing to sell, the export revenues dry up, and the government loses its tax base.
That is the exact mechanism. An economy lacking sector diversification acts like a lightning rod for these shocks. When the rains fail, or when a geopolitical border conflict flares up.
Which that region has historically been prone to.
Right. When that happens, there isn't a robust, independent manufacturing sector or a digital services industry to keep the economic engine turning. The entire system stalls.
Which forces us to look under the hood. Because to understand why a drought can wipe out the GDP, we need to look at what the people in this economy are actually doing every day. Like, what is the structural makeup of their labor force?
This is where we analyze the structural shift between industry and agriculture. Or, more accurately in this case, the stalled structural shift.
Stalled. Because initially the industrial data looks promising. The metric for industrial value added, which measures how much of the total GDP is generated by manufacturing and mining, shows significant growth.
Right.
It started at roughly 10% in 1992 and climbed to a peak of 25.9% by 2011. So the industrial output more than doubled its footprint in the economy.
That is exactly what you want to see on paper. Typically, a rise in industrial GDP is the primary indicator of modernization.
Yeah.
And historically, when industrial value rises, you see a parallel migration in demographics. Workers leave the subsistence farms, move to urban centers, and take wage-paying jobs in factories or processing plants.
But the WDI employment data completely contradicts that expectation, doesn't it?
Completely. Despite the industrial output doubling, the workforce didn't migrate. As of 2020, agriculture still overwhelmingly dominates the labor market, absorbing approximately 53.6% of the entire national workforce.
Over half the workforce. Here's where it gets really interesting. It's like trying to upgrade your car's engine to a massive V8, but keeping the transmission from an old farm tractor.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. The engine block, the industrial sector, is producing significantly more power and financial value. But that power isn't reaching the wheels. The everyday citizen isn't feeling the momentum because they are still stuck in the fields.
That analogy holds up perfectly when you look at how the value is distributed. The industrial sector became more productive, perhaps through highly concentrated investments in extractive industries like mining.
Ah, mining.
Yeah, which are incredibly capital intensive but not labor intensive. A modern mine generates massive GDP value, but it doesn't employ 500,000 people. It employs a few thousand specialized workers and heavy machinery.
So the wealth is generated in a silo.
Yes, the industrial growth happened, but it didn't become a mass employer. And because that structural employment shift failed to materialize, over half the country remains tethered to subsistence or small-scale farming.
Which perfectly explains the macroeconomic whiplash we discussed earlier.
Exactly. When 54% of your workers rely on rainfall, a severe drought instantly plunges half the country into a catastrophic loss of income, triggering those negative 11% GDP crashes.
Man. So if the internal economy is this disconnected, where industry isn't hiring and agriculture is vulnerable to the sky, the country cannot possibly produce enough to absorb its own labor force, right?
Yeah.
Or even meet the material needs of that massive 85% youth bulge.
No, they can't. They have to look outward to survive.
Which brings us to their global trade footprint. The data reveals an incredibly precarious relationship with the outside world, characterized by severe trade imbalances and extreme market dependency.
The import burden alone is staggering. The data highlights merchandise imports reaching a massive high of $1.13 billion in 2013.
That is $1 billion outflow of capital just to bring essential goods, fuel, and materials into the country.
Well, when you have a massive youth population and a stalled manufacturing base, you have to import almost every finished good your society consumes. But the truly alarming data point is on the other side of the ledger.
The export markets.
Yeah, the exports.
The concentration here is almost unbelievable. The report notes that in 2012, exports to the East Asia and Pacific region surged to account for 94.2% of Eritrea's total exports.
Right.
Previously, that region had accounted for maybe 7.5%.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that. A healthy, resilient trading nation has a diversified portfolio of buyers.
Yeah.
They sell textiles to Europe, agricultural products to neighboring African states, maybe technology to the Americas.
Sure, you spread your bets.
Right. Relying on one single global region for 94% of your export revenue is an existential economic risk.
Wait, 94.2% to East Asia? That doesn't happen organically by a bunch of independent local businesses suddenly finding buyers in one region. That looks like a massive singular pipeline.
It does.
Like one foreign entity came in, built a specific operation, and is shipping a specific commodity back to one port.
You are identifying the exact macroeconomic footprint of extractive foreign direct investment. When a developing nation sees an export spike that concentrated, it almost always signifies raw material extraction.
Like a major mining operation.
Exactly, usually funded by a single foreign partner. While it boosts the industrial GDP on paper, it creates dangerous vulnerability.
Because if you're listening to this, imagine your own retirement portfolio. Would you put 94% of your life savings into one single stock?
You'd be terrified. If that primary buyer experiences a domestic recession, shifts its trade policies, or simply finds a cheaper source for that raw material elsewhere, Eritrea's entire export economy collapses overnight.
They are highly reliant on a very narrow, highly concentrated pipeline of incoming cash to fund a very wide billion-dollar pipeline of outgoing import expenses.
It is a high-wire act without a net.
So we've established the economic reality. Wild GDP whiplash, an agrarian workforce completely exposed to climate shocks, and a hyper-concentrated trade portfolio. Let's pivot back to the human element.
The human capital.
Right. We have this massive generation of youth, that 85.3% dependency ratio. How is the state system attempting to prepare them to eventually fix these structural economic issues?
We have to examine the education metrics. And the academic report outlines a deeply frustrating paradox of improving access but collapsing quality.
I want to start with the positive momentum because it is significant. The WDI data shows a concerted effort to improve gender equity in education. Female secondary gross enrollment rose from 26.9% in 2005 to 42.0% in 2014.
That is a critical structural win. In development economics, educating young women is widely considered one of the most powerful leverage points for long-term societal health.
Right. The downstream effects are huge.
Massive. Female secondary education leads to delayed marriage, improved maternal health, lower future child mortality, and higher formal workforce participation. It's universally proven.
But the foundational level, the primary school system, is where the data shows the system physically breaking down.
Yeah, the primary completion rates.
Total primary school completion peaked at about 62-point-something% in 2007. But then it crashed. By 2011, it had fallen back down to roughly 61.3%, and the trend line shows severe student attrition.
And we can see exactly why they're dropping out when we look at the systemic pressure indicators. The data on pupil-teacher ratios is alarming.
How bad is it?
In the early 90s, the ratio was roughly 40.6 students per teacher. By the mid-2000s, it had risen to 47.5 students per teacher in primary schools.
Nearly 48 children to one adult.
And compounding that physical overcrowding, the data indicates that the percentage of formally trained teachers in the primary system hovers around only 80%.
So 1 out of every 5 teachers standing in front of those 48 kids has not received formal pedagogical training.
This is the human capital paradox in action. The report notes that roughly 20% of the state budget goes to education.
20%.
Yeah, that is not a lack of political will.
Yeah.
That is a massive, dedicated financial commitment by the government. They are pouring money into the system.
So what does this all mean? It's like pouring water into a leaky bucket. You are turning the financial faucet on full blast, but the kids are falling out of the system before they even finish basic primary school.
Because the bottleneck isn't just funding. It's the physical limit of human bandwidth. You can build the concrete walls of a school, but if you pack 48 children into a room with an untrained, overburdened teacher, the quality of instruction degrades instantly.
The teacher just burns out.
Completely.
Yeah.
Students fall behind, they fail to grasp foundational literacy, frustration sets in, and the economic pressure of that survival mode economy pulls them out of the classroom and into the informal labor market.
The state is trying to push a demographic ocean through a pipe that is fundamentally too narrow.
It is a profoundly sobering picture.
It really is. You look at the volatile economy, the precarious trade, the buckling school system. It feels like a society operating under impossible, unrelenting strain.
It does.
But this is exactly where the X-ray of Eritrea takes a massive, unexpected turn. Because while those sectors showed deep structural struggle, the public health data reveals an undeniable, world-class triumph.
This is the data that forces analysts to completely rethink their assumptions about the country. The health indicators do not just show incremental improvement, they show a systemic logistical miracle.
I'm going to read these numbers, and I want to emphasize that these are drawn directly from the verified WDI dataset. Let's look at child survival. Under 5 child mortality plummeted from a horrific 259 per 1,000 live births back in 1974 down to a range of 40 to 60 by 2023.
They cut their child mortality rate by roughly 80%.
That's incredible. Neonatal mortality, the rate of infants dying in the first 28 days of life, dropped from 42.5 in 1993 to just 18.4 in 2023.
And it's not just mortality. HIV infection rates for adults ages 15 to 49 fell from a peak of 2.3% in 2000 all the way down to just 0.4% recently.
They effectively neutralized the epidemic spread of a virus that devastated much of the surrounding continent during that same time frame.
But the metric that truly stops you in your tracks is the immunization data.
Oh yes, the DPT vaccine.
Right, DPT immunization coverage. That's the vaccine for diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus. It's skyrocketed from 32% in 1993 to an astounding 98% in 2014.
A 98% national vaccination rate is higher than many wealthy, highly developed Western European nations.
What's fascinating here is how they achieved it.
Yeah, how? I mean, this practically. We just spent half an hour detailing an economy with negative 11% GDP crashes, a weak power grid, and rural schools packing 48 kids into a room.
Right.
How does a country with those severe constraints physically pull off a 98% vaccination campaign?
To understand the how, you have to understand the mechanics of a national public health campaign. Think about the logistics required to vaccinate 98% of children in a geographically diverse, heavily rural nation.
It's a nightmare.
You must establish a flawless cold chain, a network of refrigeration that never fails, transporting vials from the capital to the most remote villages.
You need an incredibly organized, centralized command structure.
Exactly. You need localized personnel who know exactly who lives in every household and can physically track them down.
It requires an immense level of state penetration into the lives of the citizenry.
Yes. This data proves, unequivocally, that the Eritrean state apparatus possesses a highly effective, deeply organized logistical capacity when it comes to executing a specific, targeted, top-down mandate.
So the state has real power. It has the capacity to mobilize.
It does. But this is the crucial nuance in development economics. What they possess is campaign-style state capacity.
Campaign style. Okay, explain that.
A public health drive or an HIV awareness rollout is essentially a logistical war. You marshal your resources, you deploy them in a highly centralized manner for a specific period, you hit your target metric, and you declare victory.
Like a military operation.
Exactly. The state excels at this top-down mobilization. But that is fundamentally different from the decentralized, nuanced daily maintenance required to build a diversified economy.
That makes a lot of sense. A vaccine campaign is a singular mission. You do it once a year. But running a complex economy is like tending a massive, unpredictable garden every single day.
That's a great analogy.
You can't just command a market to grow. You have to create the conditions for it to flourish organically.
Precisely. And that vital distinction between campaign capacity and institutional capacity leads us directly into the ultimate paradox of this dataset, found in the governance and institutions metrics.
Right. Now, before we dive into these specific numbers, I need to make a very clear disclaimer to our listener.
Important to note, yes.
When we look at the WGI, the World Governance Indicators, we are strictly reporting the percentile rankings as they are provided in this academic source. We are not taking any political sides, nor are we endorsing a specific ideological viewpoint. Our mandate today is simply to impartially convey the data as it exists in the original source material.
Absolutely. The WGI data measures several dimensions of a country's governance, ranking them on a global percentile basis. And the data here reveals a severe, degrading institutional bottleneck that explains why that economic garden refuses to grow.
The collapse in some of these metrics is stark. Let's look at the metric for corruption control. In 1996, the data shows Eritrea was in the 72.0 percentile globally.
Meaning their control of corruption was rated better than 72% of the countries on Earth.
But recently, that number has plummeted down to roughly the 5.6 percentile.
A catastrophic statistical drop.
And it is mirror across the board. Government effectiveness sits stubbornly in the 0 to 10 percentile range. The rule of law percentile dropped from 29.6% in 1996 down to the 2-point-something percentile. Political stability ranks very low, hovering between the 15th and 25th percentile.
We have to interrogate what a drop like that actually means on the ground. How do you lose 65 percentile points in corruption control?
How does that even happen?
Well, while the data doesn't explicitly detail the day-to-day politics, it does tell us that the late 90s and early 2000s were defined by severe external shocks, leading to that massive economic contraction in 2000.
Right. The wars and droughts.
Historically, when a state faces severe existential threats or external conflicts, emergency mobilization takes precedence. The focus shifts entirely to security and survival.
And when survival is the only priority, the slow, tedious work of building civilian institutions just gets abandoned.
Exactly. Regulatory transparency, independent auditing, predictable court systems, these are fragile institutions. If they're neglected, they decay. And this decay acts as a massive, soft barrier to economic growth.
Explain how that soft barrier works, because earlier we talked about how they need foreign direct investment to diversify the economy.
Think about the psychology of a foreign investor or even a local entrepreneur. The WGI data specifically notes an incredibly low density of new business registrations in Eritrea.
Why is that?
Because people do not formally register a business, nor do they invest capital to build a factory, if the rule of law is in the 2nd percentile.
Ah.
If you do not trust the court system to enforce a contract, Or if you fear that a corrupt official will arbitrarily seize your assets, you keep your money under the mattress. You stay in the informal economy.
Wait, if government effectiveness is in the bottom 10% globally, how on earth did they vaccinate 96% of the kids? That seems totally contradictory.
This raises an important question, and it circles right back to the paradox.
Yeah.
You can use top-down campaign capacity to vaccinate 98% of the children, but you cannot use top-down commands to force two strangers to trust a broken legal framework enough to sign a 10-year business contract.
You cannot command decentralized trust.
Exactly. A modern, diversified market economy requires institutional capacity, daily consistency, checks and balances, and a transparent legal framework. The WGI data shows Eritrea deeply struggles to provide that environment, which fundamentally suffocates the industrial transition we talked about earlier.
Okay, so the soft barriers of institutional decay are blocking economic diversification. But the academic report also points to literal, hard, physical bottlenecks holding the country back. We have to look at energy and the environment.
Yes, because even if you fixed the legal system tomorrow, you still hit a physical wall. If you want to know why the industrial sector stalled out and failed to absorb the agricultural workforce, look at the power grid.
The data on electricity access is telling. It shows that access in urban areas is actually decent, roughly 73.4% as of 2011. So the wires reach the homes.
Right, the infrastructure is somewhat there.
But the overall per capita electricity usage is incredibly low, averaging just 60 to 100 kilowatt hours per year.
We need to contextualize what 60 to 100 kilowatt hours actually buys you. In a modern economy, that is barely enough power to keep a few basic LED light bulbs on in the evening and charge a mobile phone.
It is absolute baseline subsistence electricity.
You certainly aren't running an industrial smelter on that.
You aren't even running a mid-sized commercial bakery, let alone a modern textile manufacturing plant or a large-scale food processing facility. You can't run a 21st century factory on a 19th century power grid.
You really can't.
Huh.
The lack of reliable, high-volume energy acts as a physical cap on their industrial ambitions. Furthermore, the data notes that renewable energy generation was essentially 0% throughout the 2000s. Only very recently has it ticked up to a meager 5-point-something%.
So their grid is entirely dependent on imported fossil fuels.
Which ties right back into that billion-dollar import bill and the severe trade deficit we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
They are bleeding cash just to import the fuel to run a fundamentally inadequate grid.
And the environmental footprint data provided in the report perfectly mirrors this reality, doesn't it?
Oh, exactly. The greenhouse gas emissions tell the story of a nation stuck in transition.
The report shows that agricultural methane emissions represent a massive chunk of their total footprint, greater than 3.0 megatons of CO2 equivalent. Meanwhile, industrial CO2 emissions are incredibly low, peaking at just 0.92 megatons back in 2010.
Is the exact environmental fingerprint of a deeply agrarian society. The high methane output is generated directly by the livestock and the traditional farming practices of that 54% of the workforce still tied to the land.
And the anemic CO2 output confirms that the heavy, energy-intensive industrialization phase simply hasn't happened yet. They haven't built the factories to produce the emissions.
It's a perfect reflection of the employment data.
We are looking at a country facing a compounding series of massive overlapping challenges.
A perfect storm.
They have the crushing demographic weight of an 85% youth dependency ratio. They have a stalled structural shift, leaving half the workforce exposed to climate-driven agricultural shocks. They have a hyper-concentrated or risky export portfolio.
And severe institutional decay that scares away investment.
Right. Plus, they lack the physical power grid to run an industrial economy even if the investment arrived. Facing all of that simultaneously, how does the state actually balance the books? How do they keep the lights on?
That leads us to the final dimension of the data, the lifeline, external aid, and future pathways.
When a developing nation has a structural deficit this profound, the gap between what they produce and what they consume is often filled by official development assistance or ODA.
Right. The WDI data shows that net per capita ODA has been a critical lifeline, but it has also been highly volatile since 2005.
The core donors providing this capital remain the United States, various United Nations agencies, and the DA, the Development Assistance Committee nations.
And here is the hidden danger in that data. Earlier, we discussed the economic whiplash caused by internal climate shocks like droughts. But when your national budget relies heavily on volatile foreign aid, you introduce a completely different kind of external shock.
Because aid isn't guaranteed.
Precisely. Aid fluctuations are rarely driven by the local economic cycles of Eritrea. They are driven by shifting geopolitical winds, the domestic politics of the donor countries, or sudden humanitarian crises erupting on another continent that capture the UN's budget.
So, if a donor country's parliament decides to slash foreign spending, or if a major war breaks out elsewhere, the aid to Eritrea might suddenly drop by 30%.
That acts as another massive, unpredictable economic whiplash. It is a lifeline, but it is a frayed one.
Yeah.
It is entirely outside their sovereign control.
So looking at this vast, complex knot of data, the academic report synthesizes three core mandates for the future, three pathways to try and break the bottlenecks.
Let's run through them.
Number one, strengthen institutions to reverse those declining WGI metrics. They need to rebuild corruption control and establish a predictable rule of law to attract diversified investment.
Which, as we know, is the most difficult mandate of all. Reversing governance metrics isn't a technical problem. It is a human problem.
Right.
It requires individuals within the system to actively change their behavior, increase transparency, and relinquish certain controls to build decentralized trust.
That's a tall order. Number two, deepen education quality. The state needs to fix that primary school dropout rate. They need to train those teachers and lower the pupil-teacher ratio so that the massive youth generation doesn't fall out of the leaky bucket.
This is absolutely crucial if they ever want to turn that 85% youth burden into an actual demographic dividend. If those kids enter adulthood without foundational skills, the economic transformation remains permanently stalled.
And number three, promote an aggressive energy transition to renewables. They need to build solar or wind capacity to finally power domestic industry without relying on expensive imported fossil fuels.
If they can harness off-grid or decentralized renewable energy, they can bypass the physical bottleneck, holding back their manufacturing sector, and reduce that massive trade deficit simultaneously.
You know, reading those three mandates, rebuilding institutions, overhauling education quality, and building a new energy grid from scratch, it feels incredibly daunting.
Well, it's a monumental task.
But then my mind goes right back to the healthcare data. The data proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that when the Eritrean state targets a specific measurable metric like child mortality or a 98% vaccination rate, they possess the organizational capacity to literally move mountains.
They do. The capacity is hidden within the state apparatus. The ultimate test of their development trajectory over the next 30 years will be whether they can adapt that rigid campaign capacity into the flexible, transparent institutional capacity required to grow an economy.
Well, this has been an incredibly dense, challenging, and profoundly rewarding journey through the numbers.
It really has.
To summarize for our listeners, the story of Eritrea from 1990 to 2023 is a masterclass in what macroeconomic data can actually teach us. It reveals a youth-heavy society trapped in a brutal transition, caught between a historical reliance on vulnerable agriculture and its stalled ambitions for industrialization. It is a nation stymied by soft institutional barriers and hard infrastructure bottlenecks. And yet, amidst all of that friction, it remains a state capable of executing miraculous, world-class public health achievements that save thousands of lives.
It forces us to discard the simple narratives and embrace the complexity of the real world.
To you, our listener, thank you for coming on this deep dive with us. We know we covered a massive amount of technical ground today, but this is how you truly understand global development, by looking past the reductive headlines, interrogating the mechanisms, and diving straight into the raw, unfiltered data.
And I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought to mull over on your own.
Let's hear it.
We instinctively tend to view development as a single upward staircase. We assume a country is either moving up it or falling down it. But Eritrea's data proves that development can actually exhibit a split personality. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. If a state can successfully protect a child from deadly diseases, organizing a world-beating 98% vaccination rate, but fundamentally cannot provide the legal and economic framework for that same child to find a job 20 years later, how do we redefine what a capable state actually is?
Wow. A brilliant and necessary question to end on. Remember, the macroeconomic X-ray is always murkier than you think. Keep questioning the data, keep looking for the underlying mechanisms, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.